The Rebbe began the Farbrengen this afternoon that the obvious reason for today's Farbrengen is that today is Tes Kislev. 9 days in the month of Kislev. 9 days in the month of Kislev is the day that by Chassidim we observe on this day, the day that the Middle Rebbe, that the son of the Alter Rebbe, the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, passed away on this day, on the 9th day in the month of Kislev. In general, the Rebbe continued, we find in Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe stresses in Igeras HaKodesh, the importance of a day of a Yortzeit of a Tzaddik. Particularly in this incident, the Rebbe says, it has a special significance because not only is Tes Kislev the day when the Mittel Rebbe passed away, but it's also the day when the Mittel Rebbe was born. The Emes, we find the Gemara tells us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu memalish neseim shel tzadikim miyoyim el yoyim. Gemara says, just like we find by Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe Rabbeinu was born on the 7th day of Adar, and he passed away on the 7th day of Adar. The same thing the Gemara says, in general, by all tzaddikim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu fills their days miyoyim el yoyim. In other words, they live a complete cycle that on the same day that they were born, the very same day they are niftar. The Rebbe said, obviously, we do not see this by many other tzaddikim. And this inyan, he says, requires an interpretation. Once the Gemara gives us a ruling that we find such inyan by tzaddikim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu memalish neseim miyoyim liyoyim, we see people that are tzaddikim, and in fact, amongst Nesei Chabad, there are many of the other Rabbeim, that their birthday and the day of their Yom Hilula, the day they passed away, is not on the same day. So the Rebbe says there must be some interpretations how to learn Pshat in the Gemara in terms of how this relates to other tzaddikim. But the Rebbe says it may be that the inyan is so, but we don't see it begolui, we don't see it obviously. However, here by the Mittel Rebbe, it's mamish obvious. We see that on the very same day that he was born, the very same day he was niftar. In other words, Tes Kislev is the birthday of the Mittel Rebbe, as well as Tes Kislev is the Yortzeit of the Mittel Rebbe. What does this mean b'negei us? All in Yonim and Torah are there that we should be able to derive a heroa from them. So the Rebbe continues, what we see from the inyan of the Mittel Rebbe is that an inyan not only remains in koyach, not only does it remain hidden that way, but we see it obvious, we see it so in poil. And here the Rebbe said that there are many inyanim amongst us that go through the channels of machshava, it goes through the channel of dibur. However, when it comes to be brought down into reality, when it comes to be brought down into ma'aseh, when it comes to be brought down into peil mamish, this is where it begins to lack very strongly. And here what we are to take from this inyan of Tes Kislev, the hero that we can take from it is how we see the inyan b'peil mamish. We see mamish b'peil the idea how HaKadosh Baruch Hu is memalish neseim shel tzadikim miyoyim liyoyim. Rebbe said, be'emes, there's the famous Yerushalmi, which the Frierdiker Rebbe stressed very strong, the greatness of a Yom Heledes. Yerushalmi tells us that on a Yom Heledes, Mazloi Goiver, the mazl of a person gains strength on his birthday. Memele, if we take into consideration, while it's explained in Chassidus what the idea of a Yortzeit is, that kol amoloi asher omlo nafshoi, whatever the person has put himself into throughout his life, when it comes on his Yom HaHilula, when it comes on the day of Yortzeit, all these inyanim have an aliyah, have a spiritual uplifting. How much more so is it when this Yom HaHilula falls out to be on the person's birthday? In other words, on the day when, by this particular person, when here we're talking, by Nasi Yisrael, by the Mittel Rebbe, it's a day of Mazloi Goiver, it's a day when his Mazl gains strength. So it means that all the inyanim which the Mittel Rebbe did throughout his life have a special aliyah on this day, and this day is of special significance to him. Why? Because it has also the fact that Mazloi Goiver, because it is his Yom Heledes. So the Rebbe is stressing, what do we derive from this? We derive from this how we have to take in Yonim, being that here we see the poil, not only the koyach, but we see the poil, the idea How HaKadosh Baruch Hu is memalish neseim shel tzadikim meyoyim leyoyim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is making tzadikim live from the day of their birthday and the day of the Yortzeit falls out to be on the same day. This should serve as a call to us also to bring Inyanim into Payil. Not only should Inyanim remain in a good will, Inyanim should remain, we have good decisions and we have good thoughts, but to see to it that all our decisions and all our thoughts should be brought down into reality, should be brought down into Maisa. Here the Rebbe stressed, this applies, Bechlal B'Negeya, all good Inyanim, particularly Inyanim Shehazman Grama. What do you mean? What does he mean Inyanim Shehazman Grama? The Inyanim that it's a special call at a time to do in these Inyanim now, being that now we are in the month of Kislev. The month of Kislev has the Yontif of Chanukah in it, so it's most appropriate to see to it to bring down into reality all our good thoughts and good ideas we have, to reach out to as many Yidden possible and to all Yidden, that every Yid should be able to fulfill the mitzvahs of Chanukah, lighting the candles and the spiritual message which comes together with the Yontif of Chanukah. Bring all this to all the Yidden all over. As well, another Inyan Shehazman Grama, which the Rebbe mentioned, is also the Inyan of Ksiva Sefer Torah. The Rebbe spoke about it at the beginning of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe spoke about it later at the end of the Farbrengen also. And the Rebbe said that this Inyan of Sefer Torah is a way of unite. Again mentioned that Inyan, how this unites every person who has an ois in the Sefer Torah, becomes united with the other 304,000 plus Yidden who are also purchasing oisius in the Sefer Torah. So this is a way how to bring achdus amongst Yidden. This unites every person who has a part in the Sefer Torah. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe spoke, on one hand we find, if we count the oisius in the Sefer Torah, it's 304,000 plus oisius. On the other hand, we know that Chassidus always stresses that Yisrael is Rosh Tevis, Yesh Shishim Ribuy Oisius LaTorah, that there are 600,000 letters LaTorah, which is obviously a contradiction. So the Rebbe explained, Bepoil Mamish, there are 304,000, these are the letters that we have. We know when a Sefer writes a Sefer Torah, this is the number of letters we have. However, Chassidus explains that Beruchnius, there's an Inyan, in Ruchnius there's an Inyan of 600,000 letters. So the Rebbe said that when one gets an ois in the Sefer Torah, not only does he unite himself with the 304,000 plus Yidden who are purchasing oisius in the Sefer Torah, but there's a deeper Inyan, he's being united with 600,000 Yidden, because the emphasis, there's an explanation, there is an interpretation, there is an Inyan in Yesh Shishim Ribuy Oisius LaTorah. So every Yid who gets an ois in the Sefer Torah is really uniting himself with all the 600,000 Yidden that have a shaykhus to Torah. The Rebbe again said that the need for it, he said, is very, very obvious. That's what the Rebbe said today. The Rebbe said if we evaluate, when he began talking about it, how the situation was in the world, and if we look how the world situation is now, it's not becoming any better. On the contrary, it's becoming worse, it's deteriorating more. The Rebbe said it's an Inyan he doesn't want to elaborate on. He wants to talk only long about, he wants to elaborate only on Inyanim Shal Toiv, on good Inyanim, not Inyanim on the contrary. But the emes is, the way it can be accomplished, to do away, to alleviate all Inyanim Loitoivim, all Inyanim that have any sort of, that bring to the matter of a Loitoiv V'Olam, the Rebbe said the best way, the best solution to it is by uniting Yidden and bringing Yidden to have a shaykhus to the Sefer Torah. So Sefer Torah is also one of the Inyanim Sha'azman Grama, what the call at the time is now, to see to it that each Yid gets an ois in the Sefer Torah that are currently being written for the sake of Achdus of Am Yisrael. After Yud Kislev, after Tes Kislev, we know we have Yud Kislev. Yud Kislev is the day that the Mittel Rebbe was released from prison. The Hasidic calendar we have after Yud Kislev comes Yud Tes Kislev. Yud Tes Kislev is 19 days in the month of Kislev, and that is when the Alter Rebbe was released of prison. Rebbe said if we look at Minig of Chasidim and Minig Yisrael, Rebbe says Yidden observe Yud Kislev. In other words, in the sense that Chasidim for all these years have been getting together and celebrating the day that the Mittel Rebbe was released from prison, and it's celebrated with Hasidic Farbrengens and with joy amongst Hasidim. However, this in no way can be compared to how Hasidim celebrate Yud Tes Kislev. Yud Tes Kislev is celebrated by Hasidim in a much broader way, in a much bigger way. The Hasidic Farbrengen is a different type of a Farbrengen. The joy and the warmth which Hasidim give out on Yud Tes Kislev is by far bigger and more than the joy which Hasidim express on the day of Yud Kislev. The Rebbe went on to explain the way we observe it now. Yud Kislev comes before Yud Tes Kislev. That's how the calendar goes. Yud is 10 days in the month of Kislev, as opposed to Yud Tes, which is 19 days in the month of Kislev. However, if we look back, what took place earlier, what happened earlier, naturally in that sequence, Yud Tes Kislev transpired before the Inyan of Yud Kislev. Why? Because Yud Tes Kislev was an Inyan which was by the Alter Rebbe, as opposed to Yud Kislev, which was an Inyan which was a generation later. The Rebbe said that it was 28 years between the Inyan of Yud Tes Kislev to the Inyan of Yud Kislev. Yud Tes Kislev was 28 years earlier, and later in the year Tov Kuf Pei Zayin, that is when the Inyan of Yud Kislev by the Mittel Rebbe took place. So the Rebbe explained it, that now by us, it's in a way that Yud Kislev is a step before Yud Tes Kislev. Pshat is, Yud Kislev gives us koiches, and it serves as a Nesinas Koyach and as an introduction to go ahead and be able to celebrate Yud Tes Kislev. And here the Rebbe spoke by Ariches. We know that there's a way to serve the Rebbe is b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol miyoitcha. So Chassidus teaches what's the idea of b'chol miyoitcha? To serve the Rebbe in a way of beligvul, without any limitations, without any boundaries. And this has a shaykhs to what Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya. Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya the Inyan of Oived Elokim and Lo Yavodai. But Alter Rebbe says, what's the pshat if one can be considered an Oived Elokim and one can be considered Lo Yavodai? So the Alter Rebbe brings the Gemara in Bava Basra. Gemara tells us in Bava Basra that if one Eine doime shoyne pirkoi meya panim, l'shoyne pirkoi meya ve'echot panim. Gemara says, in those days it was very common that when an Inyan was learned, the Inyan was reviewed many, many times, up to 100 times. This was common, this was shriach. The Gemara says, if one reviews an Inyan only 100 times, he is considered lo yavodei. However, if one considers reviews an Inyan 101 times, he is already considered avodei, he is serving the Rebbe. What's the pshat? If one chazas over 100 times, he's lo yavodei. If he's learning one more additional time, he's already considered avodei. But Alter Rebbe explains it in Tanya. The idea is like this. If a person does something according to his routine, according to his system, pshat, he's not going out of his way to serve the Rebbe. That's considered lo yavodei. He's really not doing anything additional to serve the Rebbe. We cannot define this person as a servant of Hashem. However, when a person already goes out of his regular limitation, he's changing his ordinary type of system. The normal routine would be to Chazarah an Inyan 100 times, and he's going out of his routine and he's Chazering 101 times. It's not the one more additional time. It's the pshat is that he's doing contrary to what his usual routine is. And when a person goes out of his limitation, he goes out of his regular type of routine work, this gives the person a title. Here one can be defined as an Oived Elokim. The same the Rebbe continues applies to the whole Inyan of serving the Rebbe in a way of B'chol Miyoitcha. When we say that a Yid is serving the Rebbe and he's going out of his limitation of serving the Rebbe, so the B'chol Miyoitcha from yesterday is not the same B'chol Miyoitcha that he will have tomorrow. The Rebbe explained, if one went out of his way and he reached that many Yidden to get them to have Oisius in the Sefer Torah. So if he looks back to the way he was working several days ago, he reached the highest number of Yidden it was possible for him to reach. And he achieved something where we can define him as a B'chol Miyoitcha. He went out of his Agbolas to reach as most Yidden it was possible for this individual, so that these Yidden should be involved in the Sefer Torah, should have an Ois in the Sefer Torah. This is B'nai Geya yesterday. However, B'nai Geya today, this is not enough. Today he's required to go in a hechara b'chol miyoitcha. Today it's already required from this person he should reach to a higher number of Yidden to see to it that these Yidden should become united in the Sefer Torah. So what do we see from this? That B'nai Geya, the b'chol miyoitcha, which b'chol miyoitcha is the highest level of serving the Rebbe, this is not a level which stands still and remains in the same position constantly. This is a level which the B'chol Ma'oitcha, the Yid, is something which keeps on going constantly and constantly should be growing higher and higher. The Belik Vul of serving the Rebbe should keep on going and going to higher levels. Rebbe Tait shows that we're taking all these inyanim as a hero, the Inyan of Yud Kislev and the Inyan of Yud Tes Kislev as well. So Mamela, one shouldn't say, here we are just involved in Yud Kislev. In the Mela, there's a klal, ein chavush materes atzmai. It's an expression in Chazal. Chavush means a person who is tied cannot untie himself. In the Mela, if we have the idea of imprisonment, what's the pshat imprisonment? In other words, what's the whole idea that the Mittler Rebbe was imprisoned or the Alter Rebbe was imprisoned? The pshat is this was a Helen Vehesta on the Hisgalus of Hasidus. That's the pshat. Pshat is that there was something which was interfering with the spreading of Hasidus, with something interfering with the idea of Afotos HaMayonos Chutza. So that the same idea is the Masar, the arrest of the Masar and Geula, which have a shaykhs to the Mittler Rebbe, and the same is the Meiser and Geula, which have a shaykhs to the Alter Rebbe. It's all the same idea. It reflects that there's a hell and vehester on Chassidus. In other words, Chassidus is put in a format of a hell and vehester on the spreading of it. So if one is already in a position of that there is he can be considered a chavush. What's the pshat chavush? He's imprisoned. A spiritual sense of imprisonment. In other words, not letting for the spiritual idea of Chassidus to grow about and flourish. So he can sit back and say, what could he do? It's an Indian of Meiser, it's an Indian of imprisonment. So the Hira from here is no. The lesson which we take from here is that everyone is given koiches. There's the idea of Yud Kislev, and there's the idea of following after it. Right away we come to Yutes Kislev. All this gives us additional koiches that we should be able to go out of the limitations and halamis ve'esterim which are there and serve as an interference for the spreading of Hasidus, serve as an interference for Afatas HaMayonos. Rebbe went on later to explain that the Sedris we are in also have a shaykhs to these inyan. Today we read Parshas Vayetze. Vayetze Yankov meBe'er Sheva, Vayelech Haran. Means Yankov is going out of Eretz Yisrael and he's going to Haran. Be'er Sheva is Eretz Yisrael and he's going into Haran. That shows the idea of Golus. However, what do we read about later in the Sedra? That Yankov had the Malachim. The Malachim, the Rebbe said we find in Rashi, had the Malachi Elokim, there were the Malachim of Eretz Yisrael and the Malachim of Chutz La'aretz. Everybody came to greet him. And then we go back, it comes after Parshas Vayetze, it comes Parshas Vayishlach. Coming in Parshas Vayishlach, we have already Yankov returning to Eretz Yisrael. The Rebbe said, being that already we are beginning to read Parshas Vayishlach, and we're already entering, it's past Tes Yud Kislev, and we're going to Yutes Kislev. Rebbe said it always comes out, like if this year, for example, Yutes Kislev falls out to be on a Tuesday. If Yutes Kislev falls out to be on a Tuesday, then 9 days earlier, Yud Kislev must always be on a Sunday. So we have this inyan here that on one Sedra we have the idea of Vayetze, the Parshas Vayetze reflects the inyan of Golus. However, we right away don't stop by Vayetze. Yid never remains in Golus. The ultimate goal of Golus is to come to Geula. So right after Parshas Vayetze, we come to Parshas Vayishlach, and in Parshas Vayishlach, that's the Seder that stands for the Inyan of Geula. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe mentioned that Bechlal, by the Rabbeim, it's known that each one of the Nesiach Chabad represents a different one of the Spheres. The Alter Rebbe represents Spheres HaChochme, the Mittler Rebbe is for Spheres HaBino, and so forth. The Mele Bina, Spheres HaBino, it's explained a lot in Hasidus that this is the inyan of Rechovis HaNoho. In other words, a real inyan of Hachove, a real broad approach to Hasidus. This we find by the Mittler Rebbe. The Rebbe said that it's remarkable, he says, that the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Nishma, as well as the Friedeke Rebbe, their signal in Hasidus is very close. In other words, their type of Mamorim are very close to the same type of style as the Mamorim of the Mittler Rebbe. However, the Rebbe says, how close it is, still by the Mittler Rebbe, his way of explaining Hasidus is a very elaborate way. In other words, if we ever look into the Mittler Rebbe's Mamorim, the way the Mittler Rebbe is Masbir and Inyan in Hasidus, he explains it very, very much be'arichos. The Rebbe says that the Mittler Rebbe, whose Inyan is giving Hasidus in a very full way, full measure. That's the idea of the Mittler Rebbe, Rechovis HaNoah, giving us Chassidus in a lot of shufi. Rebbe said today, which is a date which commemorates the Yom HaYilula and the Yom HaYilados of the Mittler Rebbe, it's the most appropriate day for everyone to make a good decision and make a proper cheshbon nefesh and see to it that everyone should make an additional kviyas in limud achsidus, that each one of us should make a new kviyas as far as learning chassidus is concerned, and it's most appropriate that this hachlota should be done on this day, because this day has a special shaykhs to the inyan of, to a day where, to a date which has a strong shaykhs with the spreading of chassidus. Because this is the inyan of the Mittel Rebbe. So again, it's most appropriate on this day to make decisions on making a new kviyas as far as learning chassidus is concerned. Then the Farbrengen, the Rebbe said that he's receiving comments that many times he speaks in Yonim in a Farbrengen, and the inyan is left unfinished. What's a pshat unfinished? He asks many shaylas, and sometimes he answers some of them, and doesn't answer all of them. So he was asked, why is this? I mean, if the Rebbe asks a shayla, why doesn't he already say and answer? Why doesn't he answer all the shaylas when he goes on to explain in the Indian, whether it's Benegeya, the Rebbe says whether it's Benegeya Rashe, or sometimes when he makes a siyam on a Mesechta. He raises many, many questions, but the answer does not apply to all the questions. The Rebbe says that there are three interpretations for this. Firstly, the Rebbe says that when he prepares his Inyud, not always he has a teretz ready on all the kashas. He says he's into the Inyud, he raises the questions, he comes up, he gives an explanation which seems to him a proper explanation. However, that this explanation should for all the kashas, he says he's not up to that yet. Secondly, the Rebbe says he sees at times how people sit impatient at the Farbrengen, and they keep on looking at the watch or at the clock. And he says, and they do it in such a way where they think that he doesn't notice how they're looking at the clock. So Mamela, the Rebbe says, he doesn't want to make it more inconvenient for people and keep them longer at the Farbrengen, so that's why he cuts it short and doesn't answer all the questions. A third interpretation, the Rebbe says, is very simple. He says he answers some of them, and he wants that the audience, the crowd that comes to the participants at the Farbrengen, should also get involved into the Inyan, and we should also clear our eye and use our heads. And Mamela, we should also come up with some terutzim. So he doesn't want to serve us everything complete and give us a kasha and kashas and terutzim on everything. So the Rebbe says he answers some of it, but the rest he leaves for us. We should also be able to cook noch in the Inyan and get involved in the Inyan, and Mamela, we will find the teretz on the Inyan. And then the Rebbe went on to learn a Rashi in this week's Sedre. And as we know the klal from the Rebbe keeps on saying how accurate every word in Rashi is. And based on this accuracy, it serves in two ways. One way, the Rebbe claims, every word in Rashi is extremely accurate. So Mamela, we have to understand everything that Rashi explains. And the other inyan which the Rebbe says is being that Rashi's inyan is to always tell us pshat, extremely accurate as far as pshutishal mikra is concerned. Mamela, at many times the Rebbe says there's a question that arises if we go through pshutishal mikra and we don't find that Rashi should give us any comment on it. And this week said the Rebbe stellt sich on both types of shilas. The first one was a Rashi which the Rebbe learned in a wenig. In Parshas Vayetze, this week said right away the first pasuk of Shishi, that is Kapitel Lamed Aleph pasuk Yud Zayin. Pasuk says, Vayokom Yankov, Vayiso es Bonov, Vesnoshav Alagamal. That Yankov rose and he put his children and his wives Alagamalam on the donkeys. So if we will to look into Rashi, Rashi says Pshat, Hikdim Schorem Lenekevis. What Rashi saying, first Yankov put his sons on the Gemalim, later it was when Yankov put secondly the Noshim ala Gemalim. So we find by Yankov that Hikdim Schorem Lenekevis. Rashi goes on weiter. By Esav we find Hikdim Nekevis l'schor. Shenema, there's a pasuk weiter. In Parshas Vayishlach, I think it is, Vayikach Esav es Noshav es Bonav. So we find by Esav the contrary, that first Esav took as Noshav, and later he took as Bonav. So Esav took first the Nekevis, and later he took the Schorem Debon. This is all what Rashi says. Rebbe says, Rashi brings out something, and obviously Rashi doesn't finish. Rashi brings how we find a different approach, how Yankov approached traveling with his family, as opposed how Esav traveled with his family. That when Yankov had to get his family up on the Gemalim, first he put Vayetze as Bonov, and later he put as Noshav. However, by Esav, we find Fakir. So what? So what's the conclusion? Rashi doesn't come to any kind of reason why Taka did Yankov do this way, or why did Esav do this way. Rashi gives no time for it. Furthermore, let us look into the Pasuk. Pasuk uses the expression Bonov Noshav. Rashi drifts away Malishna Dikra. Rashi doesn't use the Lashon of the Pasuk, and Rashi uses Hikdim Zechorim V'Nekevis. Uses a different Lashon. Why? Rashi could have used the same expression the Pasuk uses, Hikdim Bonov L'Noshav. Rebbe went on to explain, and learned Pshat as follows, that the Emes, Mefarshim, commentaries on Rashi, already give reason, they complete what Rashi is saying. They say the Pshat, but what Rashi is saying, Hikdim Schorim and Nekevis by Yankov. However, Esav is Hikdim, Nekevis l'Schorim. Because this is the difference between Yankov and Esav. Yankov was an Ishtam, Yoshev Aholim, Yankov was an Erlich Yid, Yankov had no Shaykhs to Nekevis. Mamela's the view of Yankov was, Hikdim Schorim and Nekevis, like it was Noshav. First he put Bonav on the Gmalim, after putting Bonav on the Gmalim, he put Noshav on the Gmalim. However, Esav, we all know how Esav behaved as far as Noshav. We already learned in Rashi earlier that when Rashi tells us Pshat, that when Esav, the Noshim that Esav married, so Rashi tells us, Hoisif Rishal Rishasa, we know the type of life Esav ran when Bishaychas to Nekevis. So Mamela by Esav, a prime minion was always Nekevis. So Mamela by Esav first played a role by him, the union of Nekevis. Zecharim was secondary. Rebbe said, this is what Mefarshim say. However, if we look carefully, there's something else which the Rebbe is asking. We have a rule. When does Rashi raise a contradiction between two psukim? We have one pasuk that says Pshat one way. We have another pasuk that says Pshat another way. Rashi points out the contradiction always when we learn the second pasuk. Why? Because when the child is learning the first pasuk, the child isn't troubled. The child isn't troubled with any problem yet. He's learning a Galata pasuk he has no shaylos, no kashas. However, when we come Vayetze, we find something contradictory, so Rashi has to bavar and say, listen, this is the reason why we find the difference between the two psukim. If so, the Rebbe is asking, why is it that when Rashi wants to explain the difference between Yankov's approach to Schorim and Nekevis as opposed to Esav's approach to Schorim and Nekevis, Rashi should have said it Vayetze. Vayetze, when we find the difference of expression, how Esav handled, and Esav was Vayikach es Noshav es Bonov, so Rashi there should have asked the Shaila, why is it that Esav is Lokeach es Noshav es Bonov, Noshav first. However, we learned Freya that Yankov did not do that. And because the child that's learning Chumash now doesn't know yet that Esav handled any different. So why does Rashi have to come now to the child and say, Kinda Meise? You should know that we will learn Vayetze. We will learn Vayetze a Parsha, and we will find Vayetze that Esav did the contrary what Yankov did. God is learning Pshat. The emes is the child who's learning Chumash here. Has a ganz another Shail. Child is learning Chumash. First of all, the Rebbe asked, there's another Shail. Dina heichan hoisa. Vayetze es Bonov, ves Noshav. What's about Dina? Yankov had a daughter, a sister to the brothers, by the name of Dina. In fact, Vayetze, we have a Rashi Vayetze in the next Sedra, in Pashas Vayishlach, Rashi there uses the expression, V'Dina heichan hoisa. Where was Dina? So the question arises here again, where is Dina? He's putting, in what sequence did he put Dina ala Gmalim? It's Vayisa as Bonov first. First he put his Bonim ala Gmalim, then Noshav, Rachel and Leah. What happened to Dina? Also the Rebbe is asking. Another Shail. There's a concept of Kibbud Ein, Kibbud Avein. This union of Kibbud Avein, we know the Ovis adhere to. Not only did the Ovis adhere to Kibbud Avein, we know very well, for the child that's learning Chumash now, he's already gone through, that Esav tried to put up an impression that he was observing Kibbud Avein. So the Ovis definitely were adhering to Kibbud Avein full. So if here, Yankov and his family are about to travel, Yankov had already grown-up children. The children weren't no babies. There was a Reuven, there was a Shimon, Levi. So Reuven and Shimon saw that Vayokam Yankov, Vayisa is Bonov, and he's starting to put his Bonim first, Alag Malim. So Reuven and Shimon, the Rebbe is asking, should have complained to Yankov's attitude. Why? Because they should have complained. There's an meaning of Kibbud Ein. And as far as Kibbud Ein is concerned, they are mechuyev b'Kibbud Ein. And Mela Yankov should have seen to it that first their mother, whether it's their mother Leah, I don't know if Rachel didn't have no children here yet, but their mother Leah should have gone on the Gmal. Excuse me? Oh, that's right. Their mother of Leah and the children of Rachel should have gone on the Gmalim. Excuse me, the mother should have gone first, and later the children should have gone. So the Hashayla with Kibbud Ein. Mela, based on this question, Rashi tells us, Hiktim Schorim L'Nekevus. And this Lashon and Rashi already emphasizes also Dina Heicham Hoysef. Not the Pshat, Yankov didn't take care of Dina. But this was Yankov's approach. It wasn't contradictory to Kibbud Ein. Yankov, when it came to arranging for Zechorim and the Keves, Yankov's arrangement was, first he arranged for the Zechorim, and later he arranged for the Keves. The Melo, when the Pasuk says Vayisa is Bono first, and later he put Noshav, so Noshav doesn't just mean literally what Noshav means, Rachel and Leah. Noshav would include Dina as well. Why? Because this is how Rashi is learning Pshat, Higdim Zechorim and the Keves. This is Yankov's attitude. However, Esav, Punkt Vaker, Esav higdim nekeves l'schorim. Shenema vayikach Esav es noshav ve'es bonov. So first he put noshav, and later he put bon. Then Rashi, if we look into Rashi carefully, Rashi says vayikach Esav es noshav ve'es bonov v'goyma. Again, Rashi is extremely accurate. So if Rashi uses the word v'goyma, that means Rashi is here to hint us whatever the pasuk says right. If we were to look weiter on the pasuk, tremendous question arises. Pasuk says, "Vayikach Esav es noshav, ves bonav, ves benoisav." So the whole Rashi gives us here a whole reasoning that Esav paid attention to the Nekeves first. That's why he took noshav first. Later he took bonav. What was benoisav? Benoisav also fall into the category of Nekeves. So we see that Esav, now we're talking about Esav. Esav took care of his bonim first, and later he took care of Benoisav. And we see that Rashi, with his V'goyma, is hinting somehow to this Benoisav. So if we look into the pasuk, Chavek, this whole lineage which we just explained, the whole Yisoid of Rashi. The whole Rashi's Yisoid is that by Yankov has an attitude that by him the Keves are secondary. Mashenkin, Esav is fakocht in the Keves. Memele, he takes care of the Keves first. Gloma gucken weiter am Pasuk. Anochanami took care of the Keves first, but what happened later? Bono, but back to Benoisav. The Rebbe said, what could be said is how Esav Taka misbehaved morally in the sense of Nekeves. However, he wasn't like Lot. By Lot, we learn that Lot was mizana with his own daughter. However, by Esav, it was not so. Memela, Esav was Taka a type of person that hikdim schorim lenekeves, but not his own children. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Thank you. Hikdim nekeves l'schorim in general. However, when it was a question of Benoisav, it was a question of his own children. Taka not the Rebbe said it could be a Mekena Zoizogim Pshat, but again, Rebbe did not satisfy himself with this type of a Pshat. And the Rebbe again said that this inyan remains not answered, not unanswered, incomplete, because why is it that if we look right into the pasuk, we talk about Beferish, find that afterwards he put benoisav on the Gemalim, so it's an obvious pasuk. The Hemshech pasuk obviously contradicts to what whole inyan which Rashi says, and yet stronger is the question based on the Vegoima. We see Rashi does want to hint something to the Hemshech pasuk because Rashi brings the Vegoima, and this the Rebbe left unanswered. Another inyan which the Rebbe explained in this week's Sedra has a shaykhus to Rashi, but here again it's the opposite way. The Rebbe says it's an inyan which obviously should be explained. Rashi should comment on it, and we see that Rashi passes it and Rashi doesn't say anything. And that's later in the Sedra, where Lavan and Yankiv have their confrontation. And Lavan says, Vayema Lavan Yankiv, Hine Hagala Azeh, it's Pasuk Nun Aleph in Kapitel Lamed Aleph, if the Shvi. V'hine hamatzeva shi'erisi beini yibanecha. Then he goes on, Eid Hagala Azeh, V'eida hamatzeva, Im Oni le'ever elecha Sagala Azeh, V'im ato le'saver elaya Sagala Azeh, V'samatzeva hazois l'ro. In other words, they're making an agreement between Lavan and Yankiv. Then the pasuk goes on, Elekei Avraham, V'elekei Nocher yishpitu beinenu. Elekei Aviyim. All this is being said by whom? By Lavan. So if you look into Rashi, Rashi is telling us, Elekei Avraham, Kodesh. Who is the God of Avraham? Kodesh means the Rebishter, it's Heilig. Elekei Nocher, the God of Nocher, Chayil. This is not, here we're not referring to the Rebishter, because Nocher was not observant, believing in the Rebishter. V'elekei Aviyim, said weiter by Lavan, again Chayil. Again not applying to the Rebishter. Then the pasuk concludes, Vayishava Yankiv, B'pachad Oviv Yitzchak. Yankiv took an oath, B'pachad Oviv Yitzchak. Whom does he refer to as Pachad Oviv Yitzchak? Naturally he's referring to the Rebishter. If Yankiv is swearing, he's zicha swearing Kodesh. No question about it. Lavan, there is one shame which he meant Kodesh, there are others which he meant Chayil. However, Yankiv naturally means everything Kodesh. Lavan, who spoke about Kodesh and spoke about Chayil, did make mention of Avraham, Elekei Aviv Avraham. Yankiv, who's only talking about Kodesh, is mentioning Yitzchak. However, he's not mentioning at all Avraham. The Rebbe is asking why. In Pshuti Shel Mikra, Yitzchak was Yankiv's father, Avraham was Yankiv's grandfather. And here they're like reaffirming an agreement being made between Lavan and Yankiv. So why is it that Yankiv, the conclusion of Pasuk Nun Gimel, Vayishava Yankiv B'pachad Oviv Yitzchak. Yankiv is limiting himself and only mentioning Yitzchak, and why doesn't Yankiv mention also Avraham? The Rebbe left this question unanswered. I left it as a question because, again, obviously, as far as a child that's learning Chumash, this is a question which rises in Pshuti Shel Mikra, and in Pshuti Shel Mikra, Rashi should have commented on it. And Rashi, adhering very strongly to his philosophy of explaining only in Yonim that have a shaykhus to Pshuti Shel Mikra, does not explain anything on this thing. As far as the interpretation of the Zohar, the Rebbe Taich is Zohar, the comments of his father, in this week's Sedre, where the Zohar discusses the bracha which was brought to Lavan through Yankiv. In other words, once Yankiv got associated with Lavan, Lavan got blessed very strong. Rebbe said that in the Zohar there are two opinions. One opinion claims that Lavan, got blessed, that whatever he earned multiplied 100 times more, and all this came through the blessing of Yankiv. Another opinion in the Zohar says, not only did it multiply 100 times more, it multiplied 1,000 times as much. In other words, whatever Lavan earned before Yankiv came to him, got blessed to such an extent that it multiplied 1,000 times as much as the earnings of what he had originally before he came to him. Rabbi said that his father in his comments of Zohar, explains these in Yonim al Pi Kabbalah. What's the shaykhus of 100 times as much, or what would be a reasoning for 1,000 times as much, and so forth. The Rebbe referred this, that it has another shaykhus also, to an Indian, how a person is always supposed to be very thankful to his achsanya, to the place where he stays. Ramela and Maris talks a great deal about this, how thankful one is supposed to be to the Achsanya, to where he's being housed. And Mamela, he's supposed to give blessing to the Achsanya, to the people that house him. Mamela, this is the type of blessing, which being that Yankov was staying by Lavan, so Mamela, this is the type of bracha which Yankov gave to Lavan. In Inyan, the Rebbe got to explain that we also find, the Rebbe said he doesn't want to, Rebbe used the expression, he doesn't want to be marich in politics, but he says we see something remarkable. That if we look into recent history, we see that the countries who are always the strongest are these countries that have the Roiv Minyan and the Roiv Binyan of Bnei Yisrael. Talking about Russia, Rebbe says Russia was an extremely powerful country. And at that time, the United States was very much afraid even of Russia, and afraid to get close to Russia. At the time, the Roiv Minyan and Roiv Binyan of Bnei Yisrael were there. If we are to look in later years, and the Rebbe says more particularly, as it will be referred to after the Second World War, when a larger portion of Yidden crossed the sea and came over here to the United States, and this country became the country that has the Roiv Minyan and the Roiv Binyan of Bnei Yisrael, the Rebbe says bracha has came to this country. And Mamela now, it says, if we were to look as far as the other countries, in the United States, the Rebbe says the United States is looked up to, and considered a strong country and a most powerful country in the world. The Rebbe says again, why is this? Also because it houses and has within itself the Roiv Minyan and Roiv Binyan of Bnei Yisrael. The Rebbe says he doesn't want to get into a long arichas of it, doesn't want to elaborate on it, but if we look carefully, we will see that it is accurately so. Towards the end of Farbrengen, the Rebbe again spoke about the importance, which we spoke about earlier, about the importance of seeing to it that every Yid should have an ois in the Sefer Torah. The Rebbe stressed the fact that he's stressing that much the Inyan of Sefer Torah, and he's also talking about the Inyanim Shazman Grama, which we spoke about in the first Sikha, seeing that everybody should know about the Inyan, every Yid should know about Chanukah, about the mitzvahs that have to do with Chanukah. This does not in any way mean that all the other mitzvahs, which are key mitzvahs and major mitzvahs, chas v'chalila, are not as important, or not to be, we don't have to do in them with the same type of koch as these inyanim. And again, the Rebbe urged very strongly and asked very strongly that we be involved primarily in the inyan of Sefer Torah, together with Sefer Torah, also in all other mitzvahs. And the Rebbe mentioned all of the 10 mitzvahs, which all these are key mitzvahs, which lead to the observance of all the other mitzvahs, and again urged extremely strong to see to it that we're involved in all these inyanim, and particularly in the inyanim Shazman Grama, the inyanim of Chanukah, and the inyan of Sefer Torah. Towards the end of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe also said to make an announcement that tonight there is a Malava Malke at the Jewish Center, which is fundraising Malava Malke for Miftzah Neshek, for the Miftzah of Neir Shabbos Kodesh. The Rebbe asked that this should be announced so that everybody should take part in the Malava Malke and make contributions for the Miftzah of Neir Shabbos Kodesh. So basically the Sichas of today's Farbrengen.